Hello marketing research students and SPSS users. In this tutorial, we're going to learn how to create a dummy variable from two or more variables. So we're in SPSS right now. And first of all, I guess we should bring up, what's a dummy code? A dummy code is any scenario where we have a simple 0 or 1 coding scheme that we are using inside of our data set. So any case where you see a 0 or 1 present as the only way that we're coding the data, that'll be considered a dummy code. The term dummy code is often used in the world of linear regression and other statistical methods. For our purposes, in many cases, you can think of a 0 or 1 as a case where it's a nominal variable with only two categories. So anytime you see a column of data with nothing but zeros and ones, we could consider that a dummy code for our purposes. And what we're going to do here is we're going to create a dummy variable that actually merges two different variables together. So let's take a look at this image I created here. It's not the most beautiful image in the world. But first we have a variable in our data set called gender. For gender, we had people either identify themselves as males, females, or else. We also have a measure in our data set about employment status, whether the person works full-time, part-time, or several other categorizations. To show you quickly, we go find our employment status variable here. The person works full-time, part-time, might be searching for work, voluntary employed, or something else. For our purposes, we can just recognize that there's other categories. These are both clearly nominal variables. But what I'd like to do is create a new variable, a variable that essentially overlaps these two concepts, such that if someone is a male and is full-time employed, they'll be coded as a 1. If they're anything else, they'll be coded as a 0. So if they're a male who works part-time, they'd be coded as a 0. If they're a full-time worker who's a female, they'd be coded as a 0. And if there's some other category and a female, they'd be coded as a 0, and so on. So we really want this intersection of these two different criteria. From a marketing standpoint, you can see this is pretty practical. In many cases, our marketing segments are made up of multiple different variables. For example, if for some reason we had a very simple segmentation scheme that simply said males who are full-time workers are part of this segment, well, those people would be coded as a 1. Anybody else, any other status, would be coded as a 0. So we oftentimes want to take multiple variables and merge them and create a single dummy code because we're often interested in using multiple variables to create segmentation schemes in marketing. Here's how we can do this in SPSS. There's many ways to do this in SPSS. I'm going to show you one of the more simple ways. It might not be the quickest way, but I think it applies some of the basic tools you already have and shows it in a step-by-step manner. So here's what we're going to do. First we go to transform, and we're going to recode into different variables. I'll hit reset here because I have some old stuff. And we're going to take the one by one, we'll take the variables that we're going to be using. So in this case, we'll have to find gender. So we have our gender recode here. I'm going to give this I'll call this gender placeholder. I'm giving the name placeholder because ultimately this is only an intermediate step towards my final variable. I'm going to probably delete this when I'm all done with it. So I'll hit change here. So now I have a new variable. I'll set my old and new values. And my old new values are as follows. Previously, I had looked at my code book and I determined that I know that males in the old variable were coded as 1s. In the new value that I'm going to be creating, I want them to also be still coded as 1s. I checked the code book to ensure that the old value of males was a 1. If they were coded as something different, say a 2, I would have had to put a 2 here on the left-hand side. Now, all other values, anything else other than male, I'm going to have this person be recoded as a 0. So whether they're female or marked as other, or if their data is missing, we can code them as a 0. We'll hit continue, and we can go ahead and run this. Now let's do this step again. For our other variable, we'll go to transform, recode into different variables. I will clear out and find my employment status variable. Here's employment status, bring it in. And I'll call this new one again, employment placeholder. I'll click old and new values. And again, I checked my code book to ensure I needed to find out what the old code was for a full-time employee. Well, again, it happens to be that a full-time worker was coded as a 1. That's the old value. And I only knew this because I checked my code book. My new value, again, I'll bring it over as a 1. Again, this value of 1 here, if the full-time employee code was a 4, I would have had to use a 4 here. Now all other values, regardless of their other statuses, I will code them as a 0. We'll add them in, hit continue. Now for those of you who might be a little more comfortable with using recoded in different variables, you may have noticed that there was a way for me to, in this particular instance, I could have done employment status and gender recode simultaneously without having to do 2 separate steps here. I won't talk about that right now, but I do encourage you to think about how you could have done that. Hit OK. So I've run this again. Let's take a look at our actual data, see if this worked. I should scroll to the far right, and sure enough, we have our gender placeholder and our employment placeholder. And now, looking at these 2 columns, I know that if someone was a 1 for employment, they're full-time, and if they're 1 here, they're a male. If they are a 1 in both of the columns, I want a new variable that flags them as being both male and a full-time worker. However, for example, look at this row. This person's a male who is something other than full-time. I don't want this person in my new variable coded as a 1. I want them coded as a 0. Here's how we can do this. We'll go to transform, compute variable. I'll hit reset here. I was working on a different function. We'll make a new variable called male full-time. In our expression, we're going to take advantage of what happens when you multiply anything by 0. It turns into 0. So we have our 2 new variables. We have the gender placeholder, and we're going to multiply that by the employment placeholder. And look what's going to happen here. If someone is a male, which means they're a 1, it'll be multiplied by whatever value for employment. If they're both full-time and male, 1 times 1, well, that'll equal 1. But if any of these are 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 1, these will all turn into zeros. So this little, taking advantage of the power of multiplying by 0 should create our male full-time variable quite easily. Let's go ahead and hit OK. And sure enough, let's take a look at what happened to our male full-time variable. Does it seem to have worked? Sure enough, that's 0 correctly. This is 1, this is 1, this is 1. We can run a quick descriptives. We can go to Analyze, Descriptives, Frequencies, go to male full-time, and take a look at our variable. Sure enough, we have 36 full-time working males in our data set, 164 people who are some other designation. Now we could have done this with 3 variables, 4 variables, 5 variables, and still use this technique. Again, this technique is a general framework. There's other ways to do it. There's other ways to actually do it quicker, but I think in many cases, especially when you're new at using SPSS to recode values, this really helps you follow what you're doing as you move along. Now these placeholder variables, now that I'm done with them, I could probably select these, I could right-click here and clear them out. Be careful whenever you're deleting variables. Make sure you know that you don't want them to be around anymore. But in this case, I knew they were only an intermediate step towards the end, so I was okay and comfortable with clearing them out.